Welcome everybody to part 2 of the Industry Animal Welfare Standard for Livestock Processing Establishments, presented to you by AMPC, AMIC and Leisha Hewitt. Thank you to those who are attending again the second time. Just a bit of housekeeping for this. If you have a question, please type the question into the question box. That will come to myself, and if it is something that is right and pertinent, I will drop it into the conversation for Leisha to answer straight away. But otherwise, if there's any other questions, we can handle those at the end. I think this one's going to be a really, as Leisha said last week, we had the sort of technical side of what was going on from the standard. This is going to be a lot more practical and a lot more guidance oriented to help you guys make sure that this standard lives and breathes within the industry. So I thank Stacey and Leisha for being present on this one today, and I thank you all for attending. This is being recorded. We didn't send out the link to last week. We'll probably send a link out to both of them at the same time with those links that Stacey had put into the chat last week for you guys. And if there's, as I said, please feel free to type out the questions as we go along. And I'll hand over now to Leisha.
Thanks, Matt. So good morning, everybody. We will turn off our webcams again, as we did last time, just so that you've got a better connection. And as Matt said, please feel free at any stage to shout out any questions that you may have as we go through. So this is the second part of the webinar. And during this session, we are going to focus more on sections 6 and 7 of the requirements. And as Matt pointed out, these are really the more practical requirements around animal care, around the stunning and slaughter processes, and less of the management type requirements that we spoke about last week. We still might refer back to some of the management system requirements, because as I mentioned in the last webinar, they really are the linchpin to this standard, and it's your way of demonstrating that you're meeting some of the requirements under section 6 and 7. So a similar format to last time, we'll go through the requirements individually. And remember, last time we had the slides with the blue background on, which indicate some of the guidance document information that could be useful on how you demonstrate that you're fulfilling those requirements. Okay, just as a quick refresher, remember that the terms and definitions page really is your first port of call. If ever you come across a term and you wonder how it's defined within the standard, you firstly go to that page and have a look to see if it's listed in there. And if it isn't in there, then we just use either a dictionary definition, or if it's something that's specific to the processing of livestock, then we would use the definitions that are accepted within industry under our compliance requirements. Okay, so section 6. Section 6 is all about the management and care of livestock, and it's really focused on that pre-slaughter period. So it covers the arrival of livestock at the processing plant. It's got a section on livestock handling and the methods that we use and the tools that we can use, and also how we monitor livestock handling. It's got a section on how we actually provide for livestock in a holding environment, so the conditions of the lairage environment and what we need to ensure in that respect. And then there's a section all about livestock that may be presented as weak, ill or injured, and how we care specifically for those animals, and then also how we carry out any emergency slaughter of those animals if we deem that their welfare is compromised. Okay, and if you just look at the picture on the right as well, remember that anything that's in those little grey boxes, they're really an additional note that provides a further explanation of the requirement. So things in the grey boxes are not requirements in themselves. They simply are a way of explaining the requirements. And you'll notice throughout these few sections that there's a lot of small grey boxes. So there's a lot of notes to give you examples of the types of things that you need to consider. Okay, so we're going to start off with, in this section 6, with the receival of livestock. And these requirements really emphasize the importance of sort of pre-planning and scheduling of livestock to make sure that we can fulfill their welfare requirements once they get to the processing plant. And there's 4 basic sections in this. There's a section about scheduling and how we make sure that we are able to unload animals as soon as they arrive at the processing plant, and how we manage or effectively manage any delays. There's a section on specific welfare needs. So if we have any animals that are not our typical animals, that maybe have specific needs in the processing plant, such as young calves or maybe pregnant animals that shouldn't have been transported, how we effectively manage those and look after those. And then there's a section on how we pass any necessary information back to livestock suppliers. Okay, so just looking at those individually, when we consider animals that are arriving at the processing plant, the first thing that we have to really focus on is making sure that those animals are unloaded from the transport vehicles without delay. So this emphasizes the importance of scheduling. And just to refer you back to the annexes again, if you remember last time when we spoke, in Annex A, you've got a big list of documented procedures that are mandatory. So things that you have to actually develop as a mandatory requirement in terms of documented procedures. And the first one in that list in Annex A is about the scheduling of livestock. So there's an initial requirement there that you have to develop a documented procedure for the scheduling process. And this is really just to emphasize the importance of making sure that once animals arrive at the processing plant, we can get them off the vehicles and we can get them into the lairage, into a more controlled environment as soon as possible. And that just recognises some of the welfare risks about keeping animals on stationary vehicles. We do acknowledge, though, within the standard that sometimes delays are inevitable, or they can occur without, even with the best planning, we can still get delays due to breakdowns or people turning up at the plant out of sync, and we get too many vehicles arriving and we can't unload the animals on time. So the requirements acknowledge that that sometimes happens, but what they expect of the processing plant is that they are effectively managed. And the way that we demonstrate that is that we have a process for checking those animals on stationary vehicles and taking action if their welfare is compromised. So there's a little bit here about contingency, and that sort of information needs to be included in your documented procedure. Okay, in terms of examples of evidence, so we've got our blue background here, so we're just going to look at specifically a few more examples of evidence that you can use here, and this sort of information is included in that guidance document. So you'll notice that there is a requirement about consideration for welfare needs. And we specifically mentioned those animals that may have specific needs and may be quite vulnerable in a processing environment. So such animals like bobby calves, or anything that's pregnant, or anything that's maybe born in and in the establishment environment. So acknowledging the fact that we don't plan for that, or we don't specifically want that to happen, but we have to have something in place to effectively manage that. And it may be as simple as defining what those vulnerable animals are, defining the situations where that can occur, and then just outlining your standard operating procedures for how you deal with those animals. So have you got a specific area? Is there a way that you can manage their needs in terms of feed and water? Is there a way that you can adjust the order of the kill process to deal with vulnerable animals first? All that type of information needs to be captured as much as possible in that documented procedure. And then from an auditing perspective...
Sorry, Leisha, can I interrupt for a second?
Yes,
I have
sure.
something from, I've just got to bring my screen slightly larger. Sharon,
Okay.
someone has said that they haven't, not receiving audio. If you are not receiving audio, I'm just trying to enlarge the screen.
Let me take this headset off then and see if we can, if that's...
Yeah, we've had this a couple of times, I believe, when we're doing these kinds of things.
Yeah. Can you still hear me now that I've adjusted that?
If someone can post... So I think it was right from the mention of Annex A that you dropped out. It says Sharon Kenzie.
Okay.
So that was...
Yeah, well, I can quickly go over that again. That is no problem at all. So just to emphasize that when we are considering animals that may have specific welfare needs, such as the ones on the screen, so bobby calves, pregnant animals, etc., maybe animals that haven't coped particularly well with the transport process, or animals that have been off food and water for a long time due to a lengthy transport process, we need to have a documented procedure to cover those eventualities and to cover the management of those animals. So under Annex A, which is a mandatory requirement of the standards, so it's a normative requirement, the first documented procedure that we need to have is all about scheduling of animals and how we provide care for those types of animals that may arrive at the processing environment. Okay, so hopefully you can all hear me now and that's clear.
Yes, I've got something from Vicky Stevens. She says it's back up, so thank you.
Perfect. Okay, lovely. Okay, so the second part of the requirement around receival is really emphasizing the supply chain approach and our responsibilities in communicating information back to suppliers. So it acknowledges the fact that we may not be specifically responsible for those animals that are transported under the land transport standards and guidelines. It may not be our responsibility that those animals that are transported are fit for the journey. However, if any animals do arrive at the establishment that were obviously not fit for the journey, there needs to be a way of communicating that back to suppliers. So under the requirement 6.1.2, there's a requirement there that if we identify any animals that were not fit for the journey, we have a way of advising livestock suppliers of that information. And just to point out here as well, there may also be compliance requirements around this topic as well. So if we get animals that were evidently not fit for transport, there may be a compliance requirement to notify the controlling authority as well. And then our definitions of suppliers can include sale yards as well. Okay, so it's anybody who's supplying livestock into the establishment. The other topic for communication as well is any adverse animal welfare outcomes that have occurred during the journey. So if something's happened during the journey where we've seen an adverse effect in the animals when we receive them, then obviously there needs to be a mechanism to communicate that back again to maybe the haulage company or to the suppliers. Okay, so this is not specifically saying that we are responsible for the animals during the journey, but we need to get that information back so that we can put corrective action in the future to make sure that those sorts of things don't happen again. Okay, so just for your information, the requirements around fitness to travel are obviously in the land transport standards and guidelines, but we've extracted them from that document and we've put them into Annex C, which is a normative requirement. Okay, so it's taken that fitness to travel from the standards and guidelines and it's popped it in the standard as a normative requirement. Okay, so there you go. This is what it looks like in the standard on the right here. So it lists all those different criteria that makes an animal not fit for the journey. And it also presents the little caveat at the bottom as well that said that basically if there's an animal that doesn't necessarily fit in the fit to transport definition, then there's a provision there for them to be transported on the advice of a veterinarian.
Leisha, again, we've seemed to have lost a bit of audio again. If people need to refresh, I think some advice came from Tony Beadle asking if people have issues with it. It says hit refresh arrow to get the audio back. So apologies. I'm hoping that helps everybody.
Do you think it's at my end, or is there anything I can do?
I'm not sure. My technical.
Okay?
I can hear you fine. So
yeah,
that's a bit strange. So I'm just trying to work out where the yeah, it seems to be that the audio. I've just received a message from somebody. No, it's all good. If people are able to, I'll just put something within the chat for them. Okay, so
perfect. Okay.
All right. Thank you. Just keep going on.
Thank you. Yeah. And if anybody does miss any significant sections, just give me a call, and I'm happy to go through things with you if you really are struggling with the audio of this. Okay, so examples of evidence here is documented procedure again that goes through those requirements of 6.1.2 is things like documented information like records of livestock condition, a demonstration of the process. So if you're being audited, you can talk through the process with an auditor. You know, this is what we do if we get an animal that is deemed not fit for the journey. This is how we deal with that. These are the records that we keep, and this is how we communicate it back to the suppliers. So actually demonstrating the process is fine. And then just keeping things like evidence of communication with livestock suppliers. And that can be as simple as a phone log or a list of emails or letters that you send out to suppliers, or in a supplier circular, anything like that, which can serve as evidence that you communicate that information back to suppliers. And that can be information directed at an individual supplier, or it can be general information that you send out to your supply base. Okay, any questions around the receival of livestock? You'll notice that in terms of scope and technical information, there isn't much difference in the standard itself, although the wording is more outcomes focused. So you'll find that it is quite similar to what you're used to. Okay, the next section, livestock handling, is quite a big section. And the way that the standard has been revised is to put everything to do with livestock handling into one section. So this section really applies to any type of handling within the establishment. So from unloading all the way through to the slaughter process. So there isn't individual references to handling as we go through. You can find all the information in this one section on livestock handling. Okay, and it covers the methodology that we use for livestock handling, how we're expected to monitor livestock handling to demonstrate that we're getting a good animal welfare outcome. And then it's got two more specific sections around the tools that we use. So the use of electric goads in particular, and the use of dogs. Okay, so if we just look at the first part is about the methods that we use for livestock handling. And the emphasis here is really on using low stress livestock handling methodology. So really having an understanding of livestock behaviour and how we can handle them through the facility using low stress techniques. So this would be aligned to the topics that we talked about last week about competency. So demonstrating that people have an understanding of livestock handling methods, that they have an understanding of livestock behaviour, and they know how to handle animals in such a way that they can minimise distress to those animals. So it's worth here when you're looking at livestock handling to go back and look at those competencies that are required for livestock handlers. Okay, you're also required here to create a standard operating procedure or a documented procedure covering livestock handling processes. So this is your opportunity to document your expectations in terms of the methods that need to be used. There are specific requirements around handling in a way that avoids noise, and we don't mean any noise, we don't mean complete silence. We've tried to quantify it by looking at the outcome in the animals. And what we're saying is we should try and avoid noise that creates stress or panic in the animals. So noise that really provides us with a negative situation rather than any sort of positive handling experience for the animals. We should also try and avoid isolating livestock during the handling process, recognizing that the majority of the livestock species that we deal with are far more comfortable in a group situation and move better as a group. So therefore, actually purposefully isolating livestock should be avoided as much as possible. Then we need to demonstrate that we're using appropriate handling tools. And once again, this is really focused on the types of tool we use and how we use them. And what I want to point out here is Annex D. So Annex D is another normative annex to the standard, and it really describes all the unacceptable practices and procedures in terms of livestock handling. And it's really a combination of those that are listed in the OIE document, and also for those of you that are familiar with the North American recommended handling guidelines, it's aligned also with their acts of abuse document as well. Okay, so this is the annex here on the right, and it describes all the different types of practices that would be unacceptable if these were witnessed during an audit process. So I'm not going to go through them individually, but you can just see the types of things listed there. In terms of interpretation, we have to go through that list and really work out what it means. You know, what things would we be allowed to do and what things wouldn't we be allowed to do in relation to that list. So for example, how do we interpret things like hitting animals? What does hitting an animal actually look like? Is it actually touching an animal physically with a tool or with our hand? How is it actually quantified and how do we measure it? So for things like that, it's always useful to go back to the guidance document and to go back to some of the reference material in the guidance document, which explains some of those terms on there. So for example, hitting animals really implies the use of excessive force. And there's some general descriptors in the guidance document that tells you what that looks like. So for example, a stock person who has to raise their elbow above shoulder height to bring the tool down onto the animal, that would be categorized as hitting an animal. So there's lots of guidance there that will help you when you're trying to interpret some of that information. Things like inappropriate use of handling tools, and we'll get onto this a bit more when we talk about electric goads. Anything that causes pain or distress to the animal and doesn't result in positive movement is not appropriate use of a handling tool. And this is particularly evident when we look at electric goads, and I'll go through it in detail in a second. Okay, so is everybody clear on the methods of handling that we can use? Once again, because this is an outcome-based standard, it's really down to you as an establishment to decide what is appropriate for your facility and for the livestock that you're processing. And that has to be detailed in that documented procedure. Okay, the second part of livestock handling is about monitoring. And this is really demonstrating whether or not we've got an effective handling process. And if you just glance at some of these figures on the left here in the table, I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with this type of monitoring process and the type of targets that we're looking at. So the origin of a lot of these is from the NAMI standard, is from the North American standard. And they've been absorbed into a lot of global standards and into the industry standard as acceptable indicators of effective handling or not. Okay, so we'll just spend a little bit of time going through these. So if you remember last week, we spoke about performance indicators, and we said that it's necessary for the establishment to identify their own performance indicators and to monitor those performance indicators and to demonstrate continuous improvement. So this is one example of performance indicators that you can use. And these ones are actually mandatory as far as animal handling is concerned. So I know I keep going on about documented procedures, but this is another documented procedure that you need. So you need a documented procedure that covers monitoring of animal welfare. And you can use these targets here as the basis of that document. Okay, so what we've got in the table here, we've got the thing that we're monitoring on the left, the species that it's applicable to in the middle, and then the acceptable target on the right. One thing you might notice if you look at this table is we're monitoring animals that are falling during handling. But a lot of you will be familiar with monitoring slipping as well. So we used to talk about monitoring slipping and falling as a measure of animal handling. Slipping has been removed from the standard as a specific performance indicator, partly because of the direction that NAMI is going in. So in the North American handling guidelines, slipping is still included in there, but only as a secondary indicator. And I think part of the reason it's been taken out is that it's very difficult to differentiate between what is a slip and what is a fall. So it's very difficult for people that are monitoring it. It's very difficult for auditors to actually classify what type of activity falls into each of those categories. So for that reason, we're really just focusing on falling, animals falling as a primary measure. And the target there is less than 1% of animals should fall. And within your documented procedure, you need to show where this is being measured. Okay, so it needs to cover the unloading process, which is a high-risk area for animal handling. And it also needs to be monitored between lairage and restraint. So when we're moving animals from the lairage pens through to restraint. And it's really down to you to decide where you monitor in your system between lairage and restraint. And I would suggest that you look at the high risk areas. So where you've got infrastructure that maybe is more likely to cause animals to fall, where you've got quite acute bends in the race, or where you've got an area of the flooring that isn't particularly good compared to the rest of the flooring. They're the types of areas that you should be trying to monitor and improve. So once again, it's down to you to establish the best place for doing those monitoring procedures. Other indicators, just to briefly mention them as far as handling, vocalization is a very useful tool if it's used in the right way. So first of all, vocalization has only really been validated as a really good measure for cattle. And we can use it for cattle quite effectively as an indicator of signs of stress in those animals. And you'll notice in the table there's 2 targets for vocalization for cattle. There's less than 3% and less than 5%. And once again, these have come from America, come from the US, based on the work by Temple Grandin. There isn't any really sound science behind these targets. However, they've been accepted for a long time now as being good indicators of what is deemed to be acceptable animal handling. So the 3% is related to direct active handling of cattle. So this would be, for example, the movement of cattle through a single file race between the lairage up to the point of restraint. And the emphasis here is not just counting the number of cattle that moo, which quite often I hear people talk about, oh, we're just counting moos again. It's not about that. It's about looking specifically at those animals that are under direct handling. So they're being moved by a stock person, and they're being actively moved through the system. So they're not just standing in the race. The second figure, the 5%, is related to restraint. And this is a measure that is used when cattle are positioned in the restrainer with head restraint. So it's specifically about the use of head restraint. So it's about when the restraint takes hold. So if they're in active restraint that is holding them in some way and is controlling their movement in some way, then we can use vocalization as a measure of that particular process. Now, pigs are very difficult. There used to be figures in there for pigs. The figures for pigs now have been modified through NAMI again, and we can still use vocalization for pigs, but it's once again, it's when we're looking at a specific animal. It's not just counting the number of vocalizations that we hear. It's about looking at animals in single file being moved into a restrainer. So specifically for pigs, it's about when we're moving them either into a restrainer for electrical stunning or when we're moving them into the gas system. That is the point at which we measure vocalization for pigs. Okay, I hope everyone's clear on vocalization. It's definitely a topic that raises a lot of questions, but please type anything in the chat box and we can come back and discuss it at the end. Okay, for the use of electric goads, it's very specific around the species that we can use goads on. And you'll notice there that we've got a target for cattle and buffalo. So cattle and buffalo, we have got a target of 25%. So goad use, electric goad use has to be less than 25%. And just a quick note on how we measure that. We are scoring goad use per individual animal. So it's not how many times the goad is applied, it's whether an animal has the electric goad applied or not. Okay, so it's either a yes or a no per animal. That's how we measure it and how we calculate that percentage. So for cattle and buffalo, it's 25%. For sheep and goats, this is a complex one, which we'll talk about when we talk about electric goads. Sheep and goats, the target is less than 5%, and there are very strict criteria around the use of electric goads on sheep and goats, which I'll mention when I get to the slide, but just hold that thought for sheep and goats. Okay, for electric goads on pigs, there are two figures. When we're handling pigs in a single file system, or we're moving them into restraint in single file, then it's the same figure as it is for cattle and buffalo, so it's less than 25%. However, if we handle pigs in a group system, then we are acknowledging the fact that group systems shouldn't require the same amount of coercion from a stock person, and therefore the acceptable target for the use of a goad in a group system is less than 5%. Okay, so I hope those targets are clear. There's a lot of information on these and how we actually measure them and where they've come from in the guidance document. So definitely go back and have a look at that when you're developing your procedure. I think the final point just to mention on this slide before we move on is these are the maximum levels that we should accept. Okay, so these are the mandatory targets. Remember what we said last week, the purpose of this standard, and it's the way that all animal welfare standards are going, is that they need to demonstrate continuous improvement in animal welfare. So if you have more stringent targets, or if you're working to improve goad use so that you're actually reducing the amount of times that the goad needs to be used, then that is obviously a really valuable performance indicator to include in your management system. And you may also have customer requirements and even additional compliance requirements around goad use that require lower targets than what is actually listed in this table here. So just be aware of things like that as well. Okay. So examples of evidence to cover that slide that we've just spoken about. First thing to do is make sure you've got your documented procedure or method for monitoring animal handling, including animals being unloaded and up to the point of restraint. So go back and have a look at Annex A for that. Okay, when you're being audited, you can demonstrate the monitoring process. You can show how you actually physically do it, who's responsible for it, where they stand, what they're looking at, and then the subsequent records as a result of that monitoring process. So how are they recording it, and what do you do when those targets are not fulfilled? So how do you start to initiate corrective action? And the whole purpose of this monitoring section is really to provide more assurance in that inter-audit period. Okay, so the auditors, if you're audited as part of the certification scheme, they're going to be coming out and doing a very similar process. They're going to be doing the same sort of monitoring activities and the same assessment activities. Okay, but you still have a requirement to do your own monitoring and to fill that inter-audit gap. Now it's down to you. There's nothing in the standard that tells you how frequently you need to do that. It's really down to you to define how often you monitor and how many animals you do. So there's advice in the guidance document on how you calculate that, but it's really down to you on how you do that, and you need to document that as part of Annex A in that documented procedure. Okay, so let's just be a little bit more specific now around the use of electric goads. So first of all, any use of electric goads has to be in accordance with compliance requirements. So even though this standard talks about using goads on sheep or using goads on goats, This may vary according to compliance requirements. You may be in a state where you can't use goads on a goat, or you can't use goads on a sheep. So the first thing you need to do as an establishment is work out what your compliance requirements are in terms of the use of electric goad. Okay, the second part of electric goads is all around the methodology. So how can we use the goad effectively to make sure that it's fit for purpose and we're not producing any unnecessary pain or distress in the animals? So the method in the requirements actually has some very specific things that we need to meet. So it stipulates that we can only use it on livestock that are older than 3 months. It tells us where we cannot apply it on the animal. So we should only be applying the goad to the hindquarters of the animal. So there shouldn't be any application of electric goad to the genital area, around the anus, but also any other sensitive areas like the udders of female animals or on the face of the animals. So we shouldn't be applying a goad on the forequarters of the animal. It's something that should be used on the hindquarters to make an animal move forward. And then also importantly, it should never be used on animals that are unable to move. So a good example of this is we shouldn't be using it on the animal that is at the back of a group in an attempt to push the group forward. So animals that are goaded have to have space in front of them in which to move. Okay, so the requirements are very specific around the method that we can use. The little grey box here is also worth looking at as well. The definition of an electric goad is actually in the list of definitions at the front of the standard. So it reflects the NAMI or the North American definition and the OIE definition of an electric goad. So it's either a low voltage, less than 50 volts. So this is input, voltage input to give us a low current device. So this is if it's an in-house manufactured device, or a commercially manufactured electric device designed specifically for the purpose of making animals move. So this is not telling you that you have to have a commercially manufactured device, and we know that there are some in-house manufactured electric goads out there, but it describes what sort of electrical parameters those devices need to possess. Okay, so it's worth going back and looking at that definition. And once again, this is explained in more detail in the guidance document.
Alicia,
Yes.
just a question from Raman Chandor. He's asked the question of goading, right? So I thought it was important to ask it now. As you mentioned, goading is counted per animal and not per goad, right? So for example, we go one animal 3 times and we still count as one, or not? Or when we apply goads onto a cattle, how long in seconds can the contact be with the body? Is there a maximum?
Okay, so to answer the first part of that question, for your calculations to determine whether it's less than 25% or not, you only count that as one. So you only count that as one animal. However, that doesn't mean that it's acceptable to use a goad multiple times on an animal and not get an effect, or to hold a goad on an animal. And this was a good question at this particular point, because this would then come under that Annex D, which talks about unacceptable practices and how we should use a goad or how we must use a goad. And so multiple applications that doesn't result in animal movement or holding a goad onto an animal would come under that Annex D. So there's two different things you're looking at here. It's how many animals are goaded, and is the correct method used when we are applying an electric goad to an animal. So from an auditor's perspective, they would be looking at both. Okay, I hope that makes sense. But there's no prescription around how many seconds we can hold it on, how many times we can apply it. apart from what we actually have listed in the Annex D. And then that is explained more in the guidance. If you look at the guidance document, there's a big section on the use of electric goads. And I would probably use that to establish my procedures on goad use as a first sort of point to look at, would be that guidance document. Okay, just to finish off the requirements around goads, you'll notice that we only have really spoken about cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses. Sorry, cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats. Within the standard, you can't use an electric goad on horses or deer, so it's very specific about that. And then obviously calves are covered by the age requirement, so you can't use a goad on anything, on any animal less than 3 months. Okay, I mentioned before that there are specific requirements about the use of goads on sheep and goats. And this is really to reflect our understanding of the effectiveness of goads on sheep and goats. And the OIE Terrestrial Animal Health Code and the European Food Safety Authority advice, so EFSA advice, and the NAMI advice all suggest that using a goad on sheep and some goats isn't particularly effective. However, they do acknowledge that occasionally we might have to do it, particularly when we're moving animals into a restrainer. So for sheep and goats, we've got our target of less than 5%, and then a goad can only be used when we're moving them into a restrainer. Okay, so we can't use a goad on sheep and goats during general handling activities. And then just be mindful of compliance requirements for your particular state as well. Okay, any other questions on goads? As I said, I probably haven't given you as much clarity as you want around what is unacceptable use of a goad, but the guidance document does. So it talks specifically about different species and what would be appropriate goad use and what would be unacceptable goad use for those species of animals. So definitely have a look at that and then come back to me if there's still areas that you're not clear on. Okay, so examples of evidence. I've mentioned all of these, but I just want to emphasize the third one here. Goad use is recognized as being something that is particularly stressful to animals. So even when used appropriately on an animal, we know that it causes pain and distress. Therefore, in an ideal world, what we should really be moving towards is a system that works without the use of electric goads. I mean, that's ideally what we'd like to see, is a facility that enables us to move animals through it just using low stress stock handling methods. But we know that that's not always a reality. And we know that in some systems, we do have to use a goad. So what the standard is trying to do is to make you not just try and meet the mandatory targets, but to really aim towards that continuous animal welfare improvement. So look at what is a target that you can achieve and really try and work towards improving those targets and identifying the reasons why you need to use a goad and try and actually correct those problems so that you can over time reduce goad use. Okay, another handling section that it's got its own set of requirements is around the use of dogs. And a bit like electric goads, we know that using dogs is stressful to livestock. Even when we use them appropriately, it can be stressful for some animals in particular. So the requirements around dog use is really about controlling dog use and limiting dog use, and once again trying to improve our need